You are listening to Bridging the Gap, the podcast where we talk about businesses going global with the help of localization.
Stay tuned to meet the marketing, product, and software experts that make brands international and learn strategies to speak your customers' language.
Hey Gonza, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. How are you?
Nice, it's getting sunny outside, but
Absolutely.
I cannot reveal which season we're in, so... Okay, we were having an interesting conversation yesterday, and I was wondering if we could retake it for the audience, because I thought this is going to cause some commotion. For starters, I know you're a developer, you have a very analytical mind, and my background is more humanist, social sciences, which are more... So we were actually talking, and it created a commotion about measuring things. And do you think anything can be measured?
It depends. Right now, I'm really diving into a book called How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard. And he argues that most of the things people believe cannot be measured actually can be measured because of multiple reasons. Maybe we'll get to it later. I don't think anything can be measured, but certain part of things that could be measured are not, because people believe they cannot be measured.
I know. I get that some people just don't think some specific things can be measured. But my main gripe with your argument was some things we are measuring them with other measurements. Like my idea is that we are like making inferences and deductions, but we don't really know for sure. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest problem here is the word measurement itself. People imagine different things, In practice, measurement is just an observation, and it should reduce uncertainty about a certain aspect or quantity. And people think that it should be exact. And if they're not able to make it exact, they think it's not a measurement. The point of measuring things is basically to help you make decisions, especially in business context. And anything you can, anything you can quantify is helping you to make decisions, and that's what it's all about,
So only in business we can measure happiness, can we?
Hard question. I always think about it in a way that why it's important to us. That's where you should start. We measure happiness, customer happiness. Why is it important to us? And if you start digging deeper, you probably find things that you can measure and are not exactly happiness, but are somehow related, and they're good enough for you to make, some inferences and make a decision.
Okay, so we are making inferences and deductions then.
Absolutely.
I think the person who's joining us today is going to have a lot of insight about measuring things, especially in localization. So let's welcome Kevin O'Donnell, localization expert, go-to-market advisor. The list goes on. Hello, Kevin. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Marta. Nice to see you and Jan today.
Can you just introduce yourself for the audience, please?
Sure. So I'm a global growth advisor. I help companies that want to expand internationally, help them adapt their go-to-market to take advantage of the growth potential in different markets. My background is in product leadership and international growth. I was at Dropbox, I was at Nitro and Microsoft, doing a variety of work in terms of delivering products to global audiences and helping to grow revenue internationally.
That's amazing. That's a huge portfolio of brands, actually.
A lot of fun experiences.
Awesome.
Yeah, we invited you today because we wanted to talk about localization metrics. We've been having recent experiences with clients where we ask them how they are measuring if their localization efforts are worth it, or if they're bringing any ROI or anything like that. And most of them, they just don't know, or they just are clueless about how to measure it. And so my first question, $1 million question, is why is localization so hard to measure?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say the challenge is not strictly that localization is hard to measure, but is that it's often measured in isolation of the business context. So traditionally, localization teams will measure the effectiveness of their work. They might measure word count, turnaround time, cost they're spending, and how many languages they're supporting. And these are all important, of course, but they have very little relevance outside of the localization context. And so a business leader or a senior leader in the organization, they care about growing revenue, they care about growing their business. And there's often a disconnect between the work that the localization team is doing, the necessary important work, and then what it takes to grow the business. And because that disconnect exists, it's hard to draw the link between them. And that's why the impact of localization is sometimes very challenging to put a clear measure on.
I was wondering if you have any reasons, like have you spotted any reasons why there's such a disconnect between what the managers or C-level executives think and then the linguists, the localization managers? What is the reason behind that?
Yeah, I think there's lots of reasons. And the way I think about it is, if you think about how localization often starts in most companies, it often begins somewhat by accident. So you might sign a new customer and they want your product localized into another language, into Spanish, let's say. So you assign somebody in the team to go get it done. They figure it out, and now you are localizing. Or your marketing team is asked to provide sales materials into Japanese because you have a new potential lead in Japan. And so you manage to get it done, but it is the solution to a very short-term problem. It's not part of a big strategy or a big plan. And then that solution ends up becoming a practice and a team and a discipline within the company. But that perception of localization as this tool or as this short-term solution and effectively a cost center, it tends to stick with the team. And that often doesn't change over time, even though the impact of localization can be huge. Senior leaders often view it as the cost of getting a business delivered into different languages or into different markets, rather than the true potential of what it could be. And so I often think of localization as a glaring blind spot for so many senior leaders. They don't think about the true potential of what it can be, and it often becomes a box checking exercise, something that has to be completed before we ship a product or before we launch a marketing campaign.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So basically, according to what you say, there are two different perspectives and they are somehow disconnected because people care about different things. One is business, KPIs and revenue and things like that. And the other one is basically operational metrics or operational effectiveness. And there's a huge gap between these two. Before we got into the podcast, I was thinking as a localization industry, what can we do about it? What do you think are the, let's say, some steps to bridge this gap between business and linguists?
Yeah, there are lots of things you can do. I mean, that's the good news. If you recognize that this is a disconnect in your company, there are steps you can take. One of the first ones I always recommend is to write a localization narrative. Write some strategy, a very simple strategy document that links the work you're doing in localization to the company strategy. And so if your company stage is around growing users or growing market share, think about the priorities in your localization team that are contributing to that. If your focus is all around customer satisfaction and customer experience and brand recognition, then think about what you're doing in localization that is impactful in that direction. And just creating this simple linkage, you can then think about a localization North Star. Think about what is the metric we can adopt in localization that will be linked to business outcomes. Now, there's unlikely going to be one perfect metric. That's not how things work. But even if you identify a few and think about these are the numbers we will track that are very closely linked to the work we're doing in localization, but they can also link to the business impact. And that is a good starting point to then start telling a story of how localization matters to the business and what it can do. And in terms of practical impact, you can build a dashboard. So think about an operational dashboard that is not just tracking your projects and your word count and your effectiveness at leveraging recycling, etc. But think about tracking the metrics that matter for business. And this will be a dashboard then you share with stakeholders and with senior leaders. So if you start changing how you talk about localization and then changing the metrics you share, then you can open a conversation. And that's a great starting point for senior leaders and stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a bit of a product perspective on this. And in product, when we do something, we usually try to change user behavior. And I believe that localization is no different. You're basically trying to change user behavior. And if you look at it from this perspective, it's much easier to come up with some metrics that could indicate that the localization is successful.
Completely agree. I always think starting with the user is the right way to think about it. So, the only reason everybody is in the company is to, make the life of the user better, convince them that this is the right product for what they need. And so if you can link the work you're doing to a customer metric or customer experience, then you're now immediately talking about what matters to the business and the business impact. So absolutely.
Yeah, this might be the missing point, basically the missing link between the two worlds, like the user behavior, the user satisfaction.
Completely, yeah. And unfortunately, in a lot of companies, the international user often gets left behind. A good question I like to pose at some head of research or head of product is, how often does your team speak to people who don't speak English? How often does your team speak to customers who are not located in the US, for example, or in the UK? And usually the answer is never or rarely. So it's a good starting point to say, how well do you know the international customer? And this is a good opening for the localization team. They are frequently very close to the international customer or have a much better chance of getting close to the international customer.
Mm-hmm. Given your experience, I was wondering, Kevin, if you have any glaring example of convincing the executives to understand that localization is worth it in certain environments you've moved around, especially in the technology area.
Yeah, I think a couple of examples, and I think it's worth understanding in your company. Some companies have an international DNA in them. The company leadership has seen the benefit of focusing on international customers and the benefit of prioritizing that, and they get it. They don't need any convincing. They just want you to tell the story and to connect the work you're doing to the business, and that's far easier. That was certainly the case at Microsoft. They went international very early, and so for Microsoft, they invested a lot of talent and people in localization and going international, and they didn't need any convincing. It was more a case of show me how to do it. And so that's a great environment. A company like Dropbox, I was there, and Dropbox, a lot of the senior leadership, while they cared about international, there was a lot of US-centric leaders, and so their focus was a little bit different. And so a company like that, where there's not a rich international DNA in the company, often you have to build that case. You have to explain, this is the potential. This is maybe how we can benchmark ourselves against our competitors and how they show up internationally compared to us. And that could be an audit of your website. It could be some metrics that show how effective your localization is compared to others. It could also be, going back to customers, having some conversations with your international customers, particularly if your company doesn't do it already. If you can bring feedback about the experiences your international customers have, talk about some of the friction points they experience, some of the gaps in the product, that can speak volumes to leadership when they realize there's a profound impact here and there's huge room for improvement. And then I would always say, find examples of how you can take localization projects that are very closely linked to business impact. So I like to start small, and that could be as simple as search engine optimization work. It could be a search marketing campaign where you do some A/B testing on different search tags and different CTAs to show the benefit of hyperlocalization. It could be also trying out different experiences on the homepage to customize it for different markets. So go all in on having a better homepage for Japan or Germany, where they really pride having custom content and showing local customers and local logos. And each of these are relatively small projects and small steps you can do, but they can have huge impact on conversion and on engagement. And then that's a great evidence you can then show to senior leadership to get more support and more investment to do more of that.
Great examples. Yeah. I would say that basically you can treat it like an experiment. And if you, for example, start with the search engine optimization or some landing pages, it's incredibly easy to measure and prove that provided you got the results you expected, you can then prove to leadership that it's worth it and we could invest more, just step by step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do agree too. we remained radio silent here.
Yeah. I was just thinking that sometimes people say that localization. That's the question you started with. Like localization might seem to be hard to measure. Why? Because you go too broad at the beginning. If you break it down into individual steps and you start with one simple experiment, that experiment is suddenly easy to measure.
Yeah, I agree. And localization teams, I'm generalizing, they don't often have a habit of experimenting. And usually for the simple reason they're too busy. They have a volume of work that is just too much to stop and think about running an experiment, because running an experiment takes a lot of work, and often you need a data scientist and you need time to do it, and you need space and permission. And that can feel like a huge leap if your plate is too busy with just day-to-day operational work. So making space for even running an experiment can be challenging. I think it's a great thing to do, and that's why I always encourage teams to start small, carve out a little bit of time, partner with one of your stakeholder teams and find something that they care about, metrics that they're already tracking. It might be qualified leads for your marketing team, and say, I think we can improve that for France. I think there's something we can work on together that's going to improve the marketing qualified leads. Can we carve out a bit of time to collaborate on this? And so it doesn't become this isolated piece of work that the localization team dreams up on their own. It's this joint venture that they have a partner in, and then that also develops this symbiotic relationship with the marketing team or another team to start that habit of running an experiment and seeing the potential for further growth.
So it's also a matter of the linguists and localization managers to be involved with the rest of the team and what others care about, I guess, because there's some idea that when a localization manager turns in a report for the decision makers, they're just talking about quality assurance improved this percentage or something like that, and kind of metrics that they don't care about, right?
Unfortunately, yes. And I mean, that's the true thing. And that's not to say that those metrics don't matter, but they matter to a point. And so ultimately it's like a development team talking about their sprint velocity or talking about how many bugs they fixed in the last quarter. The CEO doesn't really care about that. They care about how the customer experience changed. They care about how many customers retained or signed up and how the market share is growing. And so the challenge is similar for almost any team internally. It's finding a way to link the work you're doing to what matters to the business. And so building that story is a great way to begin. And that story might change depending on what part of the company you're in. So if you're a localization team sitting in product or engineering, it's going to be around product usage, going to be around maybe the customer experience and satisfaction. If you're in marketing, it's going to be around lead conversion. It's going to be around brand and acquisition. If you're in central IT, it might be around ease of adoption, ease of rollout for new languages, and effectiveness for scaling. So finding a way to tell your story will change depending on where you are. And that's why there's no one perfect metric. You have to adapt how you're tracking localization, how you're telling the story of localization to what matters for your stakeholders and your part of the company that you're in.
Makes sense. Yes, completely. Jan, I don't know if you have any feedback about how our own clients at Localazy are facing this, because my experience with some of the clients was that they didn't really have the tools or the metrics at all, which is sad.
Yeah, absolutely. When I'm talking to clients, they usually just starting out with localization. Of course, we are also talking to people who are experienced in localization. But honestly, from my experience, especially for startups and SMBs, measuring localization is often an afterthought because of the reason we've already mentioned. They don't know how to go about it. So hopefully this conversation might spark some ideas for them too. Maybe one interesting point, I was thinking how the clients can actually start measuring things. And I believe that almost any company right now has some analytics, product analytics in place. And often they don't even have to do anything. They just need to get the access to the analytics tools. And you already get pretty good insights on localization and on different markets. How are people behaving in the product segmented by different locales or different countries? And I believe that this is a great starting point. If you don't measure localization at all, just try to go into your product analytics and segment your flows or whatever is important to you in the product, segment it by country or language. And I am sure that you will already get pretty good insights, and it will spark many ideas where you can go from.
I think that's a great starting point. I completely agree. And it's sometimes funny how some of the most basic metrics are not examined outside of either global or the US. So often companies will have a dashboard or they'll talk about their performance internally, but they will do it in terms of EMEA and the Americas and APAC. And really, that doesn't tell you very much. Often they're linked to sales orgs rather than any other performance. And you can't learn anything by grouping everything together under those regional groupings. They don't tell you anything, and there's too much difference. So I always say scrap that immediately. Actually track it by country, and because this is or by language. This is what matters, and this is where you can have an effect. And for a localization leader, start with asking the basics. Where do we earn our revenue? So what is the revenue share by country? Do you know that? If not, that's a good starting point. And sometimes that will show up a couple of surprises. You might realize, well, we have more users and revenue here than we realized. Are we putting our effort into the countries where our users are? Or are we putting our effort into the countries where we believe the growth is going to happen? And what typically might happen is we tend to localize for 10 languages or 20 languages, and we take a sort of peanut butter approach. We just spread the budget across everything. Far better is actually to divide up your budget and put more of the money into where the growth is happening. And so you put more marketing effort, more local content creation effort, and then track that. Make sure you're seeing the ROI of that. But don't just spread your money and your effort everywhere. There are some markets which are going to be less relevant and less performant for your company, and that's fine. You shouldn't spend as much money there. So starting with that is important, and I absolutely agree. You don't need to create a different dashboard. You don't need to invest in a different set of tools for localization or international. Look at what your central team is tracking and add in per market tracking. Examine the same type of metrics around acquisition, around conversion, around retention that they should be tracking globally, and see where are the gaps, where are the blind spots, where are the markets where we're having retention problems, and that will show up a lot, and that will spark some ideas around what needs to be improved.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine, I can see like on localizer metrics too, that basically there's a couple strong countries and there are other countries that don't perform that well. And the question is, should we double down on the countries that are performing well, or should we try to improve the countries that are not improving that well in that moment? That is a business decision, of course. But as you say, I like that approach to scale what works. So I will definitely like advise you to go with what works. So double down on countries that you see that the metrics are significantly better, and just make it even like by localization, by localizing the core flows, the initial onboarding flows and activation, even emails and things like that. Make it even smoother, and I believe that this can do wonders.
Yeah, definitely. For a lot of companies, they will have a great sense of their priority markets and the priority languages, and then the budget will typically follow those, or it should follow those. And if it's not clear in your company where the priorities are and what markets are most important for the next year or two, then that's a really good question to start with, particularly asking your sales, your marketing, your product leaders, where do you see growth happening? What markets are most important to you? And hopefully they will give you the same answer. If the answers are different between, say, marketing and sales, or product and customer support, there is a disconnect in the company, and that should be rectified. But if the answer is identical and they say, well, these are the three markets we're looking at seeing growth, those should impact how localization acts and thinks about their work. And that's a really interesting starting point for deciding, how do we measure the work we're doing that's going to help further the growth of these particular markets. And each market might need a slightly different strategy. So for Japan, you might focus on improving the email communication, or some of your work on content creation and blogs. In Germany, it might be something very different. It might be around improving search engine marketing work, or homepage optimization. So finding the right strategy for each market is a collaborative effort between the localization team and the linguists, and then marketing or product leadership.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I was just wondering, Kevin, if you can, like for small businesses, like small and medium businesses, what is the approach? What would be your first step for them to get started with the metrics? Because sometimes the resources are limited. There is not enough education in the company. How can they get started? You gave some valuable tips already, but what would be your route of action for them?
Yeah, so if you're near the early stages of localization, and maybe you're taking that 0 to 1 step from having, let's say, potentially English only, to then having 3 languages or 5 languages, then I think you want to prove out the impact. And so I think it's very important to begin with, to measure the before and after. And I always think, follow the customer journey in terms of measurement. So the same things that you would measure for English, measure them for the languages you select. So that would be in terms of website performance. How does the time on site, session time, bounce rate, website visitors to sign up rate, how do all of those compare when we had only English and now we have French, German, Portuguese, whatever the first language is? Measure the before and after and see what is the uplift we're getting from localization. Secondly, if you are sales-led, you're probably going to be looking for new leads. So what is the lead conversion flow on the website before and after, and what has localization done to help us with that? If you're a product-led company, you'll be looking for website to sign up. So how many people are signing up, and what does activation and adoption of our product look like? So measuring those, and then eventually paid conversion. How do we track paid conversion and ultimately retention? So following the life cycle of the user journey and the product flow is the right thing to do. You don't need to measure anything special. I would say just measure the performance by market, as Jan was indicating, and then measure that against the effort you're putting in for localization. A lot of companies, they will do the bare minimum to localize their website or their product to begin with. But then as they see some uplift, they find ways to improve it. They might adapt their homepage, create some local content, curate the emails to improve the flow. They might change the onboarding flow for some markets. There's a lot more you can do to build on that and then measure it in turn. But to begin with, measure the basics and see how that shows up. If you're measuring localizing support materials, you can measure customer satisfaction by language. If it's for a product, it's more around user retention and product usage and how that is impacted by each language. So I would always say go to the classic metrics for each part of the user journey or each part of the company that's working on the product, and then just track it by market to prove out the impact and the benefit of localizing it.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that user feedback is also important here. It should play like an important role.
Yeah, user feedback is key, and in a number of ways. And this is where I always think your localization team is an underutilized asset in many ways. So gathering that user feedback from different markets, and particularly if you run surveys or you get written feedback from them, being able to curate that together and to figure out what do they like, what do they not like, why are the reasons they didn't sign up, why do they churn after 3 months. So being able to gather that, particularly if it's in different languages, summarize it and then deliver that to your product team is hugely valuable. And that's something that a localization team might not do if they're not asked, but that's a really great step they should be doing proactively to say, we can add some value here. We can actually help identify some of the reasons we see a lot of churn in South Korea. Maybe it's because there was a difficulty in using the product in this, or we were missing an integration with some local app here. And this is something we can then share back to our product team.
Yeah, this is an interesting point, because what happens in these cases is that the product team itself might be facing the language barrier, and not just the language barrier, but the culture barrier. There might be things they don't understand, which might cause the product not to perform. And I think that this is an interesting phenomenon, and we need to basically rely on other people to crunch that for us as a product team in order to get the insights.
Yeah, and one thing I've always found is linguists and people working in the localization sphere, they are often experts in the product, in the full stack of the product, because they tend to work on all parts of it. And if you talk to somebody in product or in engineering, they might be expert in their own part of the product, but that typically is quite narrow, depending on how big the product is. It might be their part of the product, might be one of the admin dashboards or the sign-up flow, but not the end-to-end. Whereas if you're a linguist or in leading the localization team, you tend to need to know everything about the product from start to finish. Mm-hmm. And so you can share a lot of valuable insights, particularly about how it shows up in particular markets and what the gaps might be and what the experience is. And if you can quantify that and link that to some of the metrics you are seeing, that's where you can have the dashboard we talked about earlier, and you can see, well, there's some reason why we're not seeing product adoption in this market, even though we've localized it. What are we missing there? And if you can connect that drop or that opportunity with the feedback you're seeing and the experience you have, that's an invaluable insight that you're not going to be able to get from anywhere else in the company.
This is brilliant. Yeah, I like that we address both the business, but also like the product teams. They could get like something interesting out of it.
So we are running out of time, guys. I'm so sorry, but we have to stop here. I think Kevin has provided a lot of interesting tips and insights. I hope everyone is taking notes. Kevin, can you just let us know where we can follow you and learn more about what you do normally with your consultancy services?
Yeah, sure. So my website is global10x.com. Everyone wants to find me there or LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn. I also have a newsletter called Unlocking Global Growth, where I talk about a lot of the things we've covered here today. So if anybody wants to find out more, they can come check out my newsletter. But thanks for the conversation today.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Maybe a slight tip from me. I was mentioning the the book in the intro. I think that it could be also helpful to all listeners. How to measure anything, and I think that it applies to localization as well. And you can get great tips out of there how to measure things that actually are connected to localization. So my recommendation at the end. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. And we will leave every resource we've mentioned in the description box. Check it out. Bye-bye, guys. Until the next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you like this episode, please follow our channel and add it to your favorites so you don't miss the next conversation. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube for updates and bonus content. Until next time, stay curious.